Today's episode is a free preview of our sister podcast, To Save Us from Hell. This is the only independent podcast about the United Nations. Co-host Anjali, Dayal, and I are bona fide UN experts. I've covered the UN as a journalist for nearly 20 years. Anjali is a professor of international relations at Fordham University who teaches and researches and studies the UN. And with our powers combined, we bring you insights and analysis about all things United Nations that you simply can't find elsewhere. Full episodes of To Save Us from Hell are available exclusively to paying subscribers. You can get a subscription via globaldispatches.org following the links in the show notes of this episode, or if you're listening directly in Apple Podcasts, you can unlock a subscription in-app. What we're doing with this show is truly unique, and I hope that you will help us keep this show alive and sustain our coverage of the United Nations. Enjoy the episode. Coverage of the United Nations. Enjoy the episode.
I think there was a little bit of disgruntlement there because they said the very nature of this conference is set up in a way in which it underscores the whole problem for me as an entrepreneur who's trying to create a business, who's trying to address a problem, who's trying to create jobs.
Welcome to Save Us from Hell, a podcast about the United Nations. I am your co-host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I'm a journalist. I've covered the United Nations for about 20 years, and To Save Us from Hell is part of Global Dispatches, a key node in the Global Dispatches media empire.
And I'm Anjali Dayal. I'm an associate professor of international politics at Fordham University in New York, where I teach and I research and I write about the United Nations.
So, Anjali, we have a lot of ground to cover today. Later in the show, we are going to speak of the precarious position that IAEA Chief Rafael Grossi finds himself in right now following the United States bombing of Iran. Listeners may remember that Rafael Grossi, in addition to being the head of the IAEA, is also running for Secretary General, and he seems to have caught himself in some hot water, potentially radioactive water, and we'll discuss that in a little bit. But for now, we are joined by Michael Sheldrick, co-founder of Global Citizen, who is hot off the heels of the Financing for Development conference in Seville. Michael, welcome.
It's great to be here, and I survived and didn't melt from the heat. So that's one thing positive, at least, coming out of Sevilla.
We're all glad that you survived, Michael. For what would Global Citizen Festival be without you and your team? So the Financing for Development conference is a really big deal in global development and United Nations circles. It's not one of those conferences that happens every year. I think the last one was 10 years ago in Addis, and this is a follow-up to that. Before we discuss what happened at the meeting, Michael, can I just have you explain the context for this meeting? Why was this called and held in the first place?
This is the fourth conference of this type that's taken place. As you said, the last one took place 10 years ago. And at its core, I mean, it's really a simple idea. It's about coming up with the funds needed to end extreme poverty and defend the planet. And it's about whether that's government, whether that's philanthropy, whether it's the private sector. It's about how do you catalyze that funding? Because we know there's a huge gap around the world. And there's so many figures out there as to precisely what that gap is. One figure that was thrown out a bunch of times this week was the fact that there's this $4 trillion funding gap. Others will flip that and say, actually, it's an investment opportunity, a $4 trillion investment opportunity. But in simple terms, is how do you find the money to meet that need?
So can we ask you a little bit about what happened over the last few days?
In some respects, it was a bit of a blur because there was so much activity going on. I mean, I was there at the conference. I was there on day one. And even in a room with the likes of President Macron, RJ Banger of the World Bank, you had President Ruto from Kenya. You know, there was another event taking place that was so loud with its applause that sometimes it was distracting and you couldn't hear what was being said on stage. And with the heat and the aircon systems going in overdrive. So in many respects, I would do my best, but it was a lot to absorb.
Yeah, so walk us through maybe what were some of the key questions and key debates going into this conference, And how are they resolved?
So, it's interesting. I think one thing I will just say from the outset, I was debriefing with one of the ministers of international development from quite a large, what we would call donor government this morning. It was really interesting because I asked her what her takeaway was. And she said to me, it just revealed to me a fundamental problem with the development sector is we don't know how to be precise. We don't know how to be clear. There is so much jargon that she said half of the conference, half of the sessions, it went over her head.
And she's the minister.
She's the minister, and she said, I have to come back and talk to my citizens. I'm like, if I can't even understand that, how am I meant to defend this? How am I meant to defend aid? And people understand that people shouldn't go hungry, people shouldn't be living in poverty. But I do think one takeaway from this week was we need to get back to basics. We need to be able to speak to people. We need to be able to explain why this is important. And I also question, people will talk about the COP being fit for purpose every year when we come to the discussions on climate change. And the discussion here is, do we have the right people around the world when it's about triggering capital flows to the countries who need it, when it's talking about filling that $4 trillion need? And what was really interesting to me is on that side, on the private sector side, I met two types of stakeholders. I met some of the young entrepreneurs, and they were almost there, to try and pitch for funding, right? They had these great ideas, these great business models, many of them from the continent of Africa, on how they could address climate change. And they were there, and it's almost like they rocked up almost asking the question, where's the venture philanthropy fund? Where's the venture capital? Where are the places where I can almost pitch my idea and receive funding? And I think there was a little bit of disgruntlement there because they said the very nature of this conference is set up in a way in which it underscores the whole problem for me as an entrepreneur who's trying to create a business, who's trying to address a problem, who's trying to create jobs. And that is it's so hard to access affordable capital for business ideas in many of these countries that we're concerned about. So I think, to me, meeting with some of these entrepreneurs really underscored an overarching theme that went through the whole conference, and that is that capital is shy, it's very hard to access, and when you do access it, it's either on significantly high terms, it's high interest rates, that came up a lot, or it's in such a way that it's actually impossible to access. On the other side of the spectrum, you had some investors there that we spoke to who was deploying capital on the continent trying to meet these needs. And they were just talking about the risk involved and the risk profile. And for them, they were just talking about, well, look, if the European Union is serious, if the Global Gateway is serious, if the World Bank is serious, how do we actually work with them to de-risk and actually deploy our capital to the places needing it? So it seemed to me that the questions was either I can't access capital, or I want to deploy my capital if I'm an investor, but it's too risky to do that. We were dancing around it, but these were fundamental core issues. And of course, there was other debates going on. Of course, debt was a big one as well. Many countries spoke about the debt distress. There was a debate that took place on Monday. There was, of course, trade. President Macron, in his remarks on Monday, really went to town on some of the trade restrictions and tariffs that we're seeing in the recent months, which, of course, has been no secret to anyone. But he was blunt. He just said these kind of trade measures are killing people when they're imposed and countries can't trade. And then I think the overarching message from the wealthy donor countries was we can't continue to give aid in the same way as grants because that debt distress you're talking about, I mean, we're feeling it too. And they said we're having pressures on our own spending. And you're seeing this right now with debates in the US. You're certainly seeing it with debates in the UK. And so the question that we're going to be able to rely on public spending alone, that was another huge, huge topic of debate.
So I'm going to ask you first how you think the geopolitical situation right now affected these talks as opposed to the talks 10 years ago? Because we're in a very different political moment now than we were the last time that this conference happened. And in particular, I wanted to ask you a little bit about, I was just reading a piece about, the disappointment that some women's organizations had with what they perceived to be backsliding on gender-related provisions in these agreements. And I was wondering if you could speak a little to how the sort of global moment is different now than it was 10 years ago and how that's shaped the discussions and the outcome documents you've seen.
In terms of the geopolitics of the situation, there was no doubt that that was on full display. I mean, one of the most prominent sessions was this event, which was marking the 2-year anniversary of the summit President Macron hosted 2 years ago, the Summit for a New Global Financing Pact, which, Mark, I know you and I have spoken about before. That's where one of the actually tangible reforms around natural disaster pause clauses, which we've spoken about previously, came from.
Thank you for plugging Global Dispatches in our conversation from last year, Mick.
You're welcome. Look, there was an event to mark the 2-year anniversary of that. And, you had President Macron up there, you had Ajay Banga, you had President Ruto. And in that, he really went to town and said, there's China, there's the United States. And he said, both of them are not playing by the rules when it comes to trade. And he said, and the rest of the countries need to come together and figure this out and address this. And he was there with Ngozi from the World Trade Organization. But he really put that out there. And I think what you saw was many of the European leaders there. I mean, you had obviously Prime Minister Sanchez as the host being very frank that he's not going to put more money into defense and spending, despite this new NATO 5% pledge, whilst he also has commitments on development, on addressing poverty, on combating climate change. And so I think the context of all of that was really, to me, is you really saw Europe emerging as this third pillar. Now, of course, Europe has many voices. It's not a single state. And it was really from many of the European leaders that was present saying, listen, we need to build new partnerships. We need to collaborate with other countries on these issues. And so that was one big takeaway in terms of the geopolitics. And then I think on the other side, in terms of some of the tensions, you saw that in many issues on climate. Someone said to me, it seems like climate's really fallen off the agenda, that people are, really saying like, this is going to happen. How are we going to fund and just adapt to it? Because we're clearly not going to be able to help countries mitigate the impacts of climate change and to fund the transition. So there was a defeatist point. But I will say there was also some positive upsides too. I mean, one of the notable takeaways, and you heard one expression, it was always at these conferences, a few phrases, right, that people pick up and run with. So one of the phrases was this concept of coalition of the willing. And one of the coalition of the willing, I guess, was this 8-country-led initiative around levies, particularly on premium air tickets and flights, business class, private jet, etc. And so that was one of the big initiatives that was announced on Monday. And there were a couple of other initiatives as well. But I think by and large, what I walked out there from many of the investors, the entrepreneurs I spoke to is, okay, like we just have to get around the table with them and figure out on a project by project basis how we address these bottlenecks when it comes to capital flow. I mean, one entrepreneur who was looking to access funding for energy production across the continent, he said there's policy barriers. There's policy barriers, for instance, when it comes to the European Union and accessing public supports and guarantees, subsidies, but also there's myths around the risk and how can we actually do a proper risk assessment to help these countries access capital at a much more affordable cost. So I think there were some good hooks and there were some good takeaways. I will say that one thing that was remarked to me multiple times is that there seemed to be a lot more ideas on the table than compared to 10 years ago. A challenge is always how you implement these ideas and how you adopt them.
Lastly, and to your final point, this conference had an outcome document, the Seville Compromise, as it's called. What was in that compromise that you think could be either meaningfully implemented or at least advanced over the coming years?
Some of the things in there, many people who are familiar with how these things go will say, okay, well, that's been in literally every UN document for the last, I don't know how many years, right? So when you see recommitments to zero point 0.7, people will say, well, do figures like that have credibility?
You're referring to the commitment that wealthier countries ought to commit zero point 0.7 of their GDP to international development, international aid.
Exactly. I think beyond that, though, there was some consensus around, obviously, solidarity levies. I think the natural disaster clause. I think also on the development capacity of the multi-development banks. And listen, I do think someone like R.J. Banga, and President Ruto gave him credit for it, is the guy has figured out a way to try and leverage an additional $50 billion in concessional lending, right? That wouldn't have otherwise been there. So I think some of the outcomes might fall short of the aspirations. Like $50 billion is incredible, doesn't necessarily fulfill what people have been talking about, and that is a tripling of total lending capacity from the multi-development banks. And then I think there's ideas around reforming the credit rating agencies, and these ideas that aren't necessarily new. And you do wonder if, okay, are we barking up the wrong tree here? Like trying to reform the credit rating agencies versus, okay, how do we actually take that entrepreneur who came to me and spoke to me, he's trying to access capital at affordable rate. How do we just give him a proper assessment of what he's trying to do and showcase to investors that you want to offer him capital at 20, 30%? Actually, it's not that risky, and there's measures to de-risk it. You should be offering him this at a much lower rate because you're assessing his profile all wrong. And that was the real takeaway for me as part of this conference.
Michael, thank you so much for your time and for braving the heat of southern Spain to give us these insights. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
So this is the part of the conversation where we say goodbye to our free listeners, but entice you free listeners to become paid subscribers to the show to help us keep on keeping on. And Anjali, we are going to discuss some hot water that Rafael Grossi might have found himself in the context of the U.S. bombing of Iran. And interestingly enough, just before we started recording this episode, I saw a note from Iran state press explaining how Grossi is persona non grata and that if he set foot on Iranian soil, he might get tried for treason. So he's being squeezed from all sides.
This is a no-win situation for him,
which we'll discuss after the fold.
Yes.
And you can become a paid subscriber by following the links in the show notes of this episode, including discount links. Thank you for listening to Save Us from Hell. The show is co-hosted by me, Mark Leon Goldberg, and Anjali Dayal. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. Our cover art is by Sarah D. Michelle. If you've not already done so, please subscribe to our show via Substack at globaldispatches.org. We are sustaining this show by selling subscriptions to it via Substack. You can get a discounted subscription by going to globaldispatches.org/save us. You can follow the link in the show notes as well. And finally, if you'd like to discuss this episode with us, please visit globaldispatches.org and click on chat, where we'll be around to discuss what we discussed in this episode. Thanks, and be sure to tell friends and colleagues about To Save Us from Hell, a new podcast about the United Nations.